The September morning came with a chill that promised an early autumn, the tall grass of the high meadow stiff with a light frost. Nora Callum pulled her father's worn coat tighter, her gaze tracing the long, familiar line of the east fence. It was her third day checking the posts, a task she did every year when her father went south to sell the few head of cattle they managed to raise on their patch of Wyoming land. The air was thin and clean, smelling of pine and damp earth, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the low sigh of wind coming down from the peaks. It was in that silence that she saw him. At first, he was just a darker shape in the dun-colored grass, a heap of brown and blue that did not belong. Then a horse, a fine-looking bay with a dark mane, lifted its head not 20 feet away, its reins trailing on the ground. The animal stood with a kind of settled patience, as if it had been waiting for some time. Nora's hand went to the small knife she kept on her belt, a habit born of solitude. She moved slowly, her boots making soft impressions in the damp soil. The man was lying on his side, his face turned away from her. A dark felt hat had fallen near his head. As she drew closer, she saw the unnatural stillness of him. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, a practical and calm instruction from a childhood spent on the unforgiving edge of things. Check for breathing first, Nora. Before you do anything else, you see if they're breathing. She knelt, the damp seeping through the knees of her trousers. She laid 2 fingers against the side of his neck, feeling for the steady drum of life beneath the rough skin. It was there. Faint, but it was there. A slow, shallow rhythm. Only then did she allow herself to take in the rest of him. He was tall, dressed in dusty denims and a chambray shirt torn at the shoulder. His face was scraped along the jaw, and a dark, matted patch of blood stained his hair above the temple. He looked like any other rider who had taken a bad fall. His horse nickered softly, a low inquiry. It was a good animal, well cared for. Her eyes followed the reins down to the saddle, a sturdy stock model, its leather dark with use in oil. And then she saw it. It was not a maker's mark, too crude and deep for that. Burned into the saddle fender, just below the swell, was a brand. A single clear letter H enclosed in a rough circle. The air left Nora's lungs in a short, sharp gasp. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The Harlan brand. She had not seen it up close in almost 20 years, not since she was a girl small enough to hide behind her mother's skirts, but she knew it as well as she knew her own name. It was the mark of the man who had bought their valley, their home, their future for the price of a lie. It was the name that had settled like a shroud over her family, the reason they now clung to this high, hard-scrabble acreage, while the Harlans owned the lush river bottom and everything that came with it. All the warmth of the morning vanished, replaced by an ancient, icy anger she inherited from her father. Leave him. The thought was cold and clear. He was a Harlan, or worked for them, which was the same thing. He was on Callum land. Let him wake up and find his own way home. It was more courtesy than his family had ever shown hers. She stood up, her jaw tight, and took a step back. The man on the ground groaned, a low, pained sound that was not a name or a family, but only human suffering. The bay horse watched her with wide, intelligent eyes. It had not abandoned its rider. The simple loyalty of the animal was a rebuke. Nora looked from the man to the horse, then up at the vast, indifferent sky. Her father was a hard man, made so by betrayal, but he was not a cruel one. He had taught her to check for breathing first. He had taught her to set a bone, to stitch a wound, to be capable. He had never taught her to leave a man to die, no matter his name. A bitter sigh escaped her lips. The brand belonged to the past. The man belonged to the present. "All right," she whispered to the horse, her voice rough. "All right." Getting him to the grazing cabin was a trial. He was a dead weight, long-limbed and solid, and she was strong but not a man herself. She managed to get his arm over her shoulders and half-dragged, half-carried him the quarter-mile back to the small, one-room structure they used during the summer months. It was little more than a timber box with a cot, a stone hearth, and a few shelves, but it was dry and out of the wind. She laid him on the cot, his head lolling to one side. The fever was already on him, his skin hot and dry to the touch. For 2 days, he drifted in a fevered haze. Nora worked with a grim, practiced efficiency. She cleaned and bandaged the gash on his head, brewed willow bark tea to bring down the fever, and forced broth between his cracked lips when he was lucid enough to swallow. In the long hours of silence, she watched him. She noted the way his hands, though scraped and bruised, were well-formed and steady even in their stillness. They were the hands of a man who worked with horses, calloused but not clumsy. His face in repose was younger than she had first thought, with a strong jaw and a mouth that seemed, even unconscious, to be set in a line of quiet determination rather than arrogance. She told herself she was simply doing her duty. A human duty. It had nothing to do with the man himself. But as she changed the damp cloth on his forehead, she found herself tracing the line of his brow with her eyes, wondering what kind of man he was. A Harlan. The word was a stone in her mind. It meant wealth taken by deceit. It meant her mother's early grave, worn down by hardship. It meant her father's unbending bitterness. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. She was sitting in the cabin's only chair, mending a tear in his shirt, when his eyes opened. They were a clear, startling blue, and for a moment, they were completely lucid. He looked at the log ceiling, then at the stone hearth, and finally, at her. "Where am I?" he asked. His voice was raspy from disuse. "My cabin," she said, not looking up from her mending. She kept her stitches small and even. "You took a fall on my east fence line." He tried to sit up, then fell back with a groan, his hand going to his head. "I remember my horse shying. A snake in the grass." A pause. "How long?" 2 days. "You've had a fever." She knotted the thread and bit it off, then folded the shirt and placed it on the small table beside him. She finally met his gaze. He looked at her, really looked at her, and a faint flush rose on his cheeks. "I'm in your debt, ma'am." "No debt," she said, her tone clipped. "Just needed to get you off my land one way or another." This seemed the most direct. A flicker of a smile touched his lips, though it seemed to cost him some effort. "I appreciate the directness." He held out a hand. "James Harlan." Nora felt a jolt, as if the ground had shifted again. To hear the name spoken aloud in this place, in her cabin, was a sacrilege. She looked at his outstretched hand, and, after a moment that stretched too long, she took it. His grip was weak but firm. "Nora Callum," she said. She watched his face for any sign of recognition, any flicker of understanding at the sound of her own family name. There was nothing, just a polite, tired nod. He did not know. He did not know what his name cost on this side of the valley. A wave of something she could not name, relief, disappointment, dread washed over her. This was a complication she did not need. Her father was due back in 3 weeks. This man, this James Harlan, needed to be gone long before then. "I grew up east of here," he explained, as if sensing her unspoken question. "My father's land. I've been in Texas the last 10 years, trading horses. Only came back 6 months ago." That explained it. He had been gone during the worst of it, too young to be involved, and had returned to a settled history he did not understand. She did not enlighten him. The story of the Callums and the Harlans was not hers to tell. It belonged to her father, a story sealed and guarded by 20 years of silence and grief. "You should rest," she said, standing up. "I'll fetch your horse. He's been grazing near the cabin." As she walked out into the bright, cold air, she felt his eyes on her back. She was not going to be the one to say any of this first. He stayed for another week. He insisted he was well enough to ride after a day, but a brief attempt to stand left him pale and swaying. Nora said nothing, simply set another bowl of stew on the table. An unspoken agreement settled between them. He would stay until his strength returned, and he would earn his keep. The first thing he did was take her axe. He sat on the woodpile, the October sun on his back, and sharpened the blade with a small whetstone from his saddlebag. The rhythmic scrape of stone against steel was a steady, comforting sound in the quiet of the high meadow. He did not ask. He just saw the nicked blade and fixed it. The next day, he felt strong enough to walk the fence line with her. They worked in a comfortable, shared quiet. He had a natural sense of the work, his movements economical and sure. He dug post holes with a steady rhythm, his shoulders flexing under the mended shirt. Nora stretched the wire, her gloved hands quick and competent. Their conversations were sparse, built around the task at hand. "This post is rotted through," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "I know. The ground holds the damp here," she would reply, handing him a new post. But in the spaces between the words, something else was being built. She found herself watching him. The way he squinted at the horizon, his blue eyes thoughtful. The way a small, wry smile would touch his mouth when one of her chickens escaped its pen and led him on a frantic chase. The way he held his coffee cup in both hands, warming them as they stood at the property line in the mornings, the rising sun turning the frost to silver. One morning he looked over the valley spread below them, the river a ribbon of silver in the distance. "It's good land," he said, more to himself than to her. "My father always said the best grazing was in the valley." Nora's hands tightened around her own cup. "Some people think so." He seemed to catch the edge in her voice and looked at her. "You don't?" "I like it up here," she said, her gaze fixed on the rugged peaks to the west. "You can see what's coming. The sky is bigger." He was quiet for a long moment, just watching her. "Yes," he said softly. "It is." She was no longer sure the brand mattered as much as the man. The brand was an old story, a cold fact. The man was here, solid and real, his presence a steady warmth against the encroaching chill of winter. He talked about horses with a gentle passion, about the plains of Texas with a detached fondness, about his return to Wyoming with a sense of homecoming that was both hopeful and uncertain. He never spoke of wealth or status. He spoke of work and weather and the satisfaction of a job well done. They rode the West Ridge one afternoon, checking for stray cattle. The aspens had turned a brilliant, trembling gold, and the air was crisp and clear. From the ridge, they could see both sides of the valley, her family's small, rocky homestead to the east, and the sprawling, prosperous Harlan ranch to the west, its green fields stretching all the way to the river. James reined in his horse, looking out over the expanse. "It's strange," he said. "My father never talks about this side of the valley. It's like it doesn't exist." Nora's heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm. "Some things are hard to talk about, I suppose." He turned to her, his expression serious. "Nora, I should have been on my way a week ago. I know that. You weren't well. I'm well now." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "I find I'm not in a hurry to leave." She held his gaze, the world falling away until there was only the sound of the wind in the pines and the steady look in his eyes. He was a good man, an honorable man. She knew it in the way a person knows the sun will rise, and that knowledge was a more terrifying thing than the brand on his saddle, because a good man deserved the truth, and the truth would send him away. She was not going to be the one to say it. Her father returned 2 weeks after she found James. He rode in late one afternoon, a weary man slouched in his saddle, his face etched with the dust of the trail and a deeper, more permanent exhaustion. Nora saw him coming from the cabin door and felt a cold knot of dread form in her stomach. James was out, checking a section of fence near the north pasture. She met her father at the small barn. "Papa, Papa, Nora." He swung down from his horse, his movements stiff. He was a tall, spare man with eyes the color of a winter sky. "Everything all right here?" "Everything is fine," she said, her voice too bright. She took the reins of his horse. "The cattle sold well?" "Well enough." He looked around, his gaze sharp and assessing, as if he could sense a change in the very air of the place. "You've been busy on the fences. The posts are solid." "I had some help," she said, keeping her voice even. Before she could explain, James walked around the corner of the barn, leading his bay. He stopped when he saw her father, a friendly, open expression on his face. "You must be Mr. Callum," he said, extending a hand. "I'm James Harlan." "It's a pleasure to meet you, sir. Your daughter has been a great help to me." Nora watched her father's face. At the name Harlan, a flicker of something hard and cold passed through his eyes, but he took the offered hand, his grip firm. "Callum," he said, his voice flat. "You had an accident?" "A fall." "Nothing serious, thanks to Nora." Her father's gaze shifted from James to the bay horse, and then it settled on the saddle. He stared at the fender, at the burned circle with the H inside. The silence that fell was heavy and absolute. The friendly air of the afternoon evaporated, replaced by something brittle and dangerous. "That's a Harlan saddle," her father said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of 20 years of bitterness. James looked from her father to the saddle, a confused frown creasing his brow. "Yes, sir. It was my father's." I know," Mr. Callum said, his eyes never leaving the brand. "I know the mark." He finally lifted his gaze to James, and his eyes were chips of ice. "You're Jedediah Harlan's boy." "Yes, sir." Everything broke open. The carefully constructed piece of the past weeks shattered like glass. Her father turned to her, and the look on his face was one of deep, cutting betrayal. "You knew," he said. It was not a question. "You knew who he was, and you let him stay here." "Papa, he was hurt," Nora pleaded, her voice small. "Hurt?" Her father laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "That family has done nothing but hurt us. They took our land, Nora. They built their fortune on a handshake and a lie, and left us with this rock pile. And you invite his son into our home?" James stood frozen, his face a mask of confusion and shock. "I don't understand," he said, looking from father to daughter. "What lie? What are you talking about?" "Ask your father," Mr. Callum spat, turning his back on them both. "Ask Jedediah Harlan what happened to the Callum ranch 20 years ago. Ask him about the partnership deed he was supposed to file. Ask him how he ended up with the whole valley, and my partner, your grandfather, ended up with nothing but a bullet in his chest from a claim jumper that Jedediah was supposed to have warned him about." Nora felt the blood drain from her face. She had known the story of the lost land, but not all of it. Not the part about her grandfather. Her father pointed a trembling finger at James. "Get off my land, and take that saddle with you." James looked at Nora, his blue eyes filled with a storm of questions and a dawning, terrible understanding. The distance that opened between them in that moment was wider than the entire valley. He saw the truth she had been hiding in her own eyes. Without another word, he swung himself onto his horse. He did not look at her father again. His gaze was fixed on her, a look of profound hurt and resolution. "I will," he said, his voice low and steady. "I will ask him." Then he turned his horse and rode away, the sound of the hoofbeats fading into the cold, quiet dusk. Nora stood there, the space he left behind a physical ache in the air, and watched him go, knowing that everything depended on the answer to a question that should have been asked 2 decades ago. She did not see him for 4 days. The silence that returned to the cabin was different now. It was not the peaceful solitude she had always known. It was an empty, aching void. Her father did not speak of it. He moved about his chores with a grim, rigid silence, his anger a palpable presence between them. He was repairing a harness one afternoon when she finally broke the quiet. "It wasn't his fault, Papa." Her father didn't look up from the leather he was stitching. "He wears the name." He didn't know the story. He was in Texas. "Ignorance doesn't change the facts," he said, pulling a stitch tight with a vicious tug. "The Harlans are thieves." "He isn't," she said, her voice shaking with a sudden, fierce conviction. "He's a good man." Her father finally stopped his work and looked at her, his eyes softening just a fraction. "Nora," he said, his voice weary, "a good man from a bad family is still a rope that will hang you. It's better this way." But it was not better. It was worse. Every morning she looked toward the east fence, half expecting to see him there, and every morning the emptiness of the landscape was a fresh wound. James rode home with her father's words echoing in his head. The accusations felt like a physical blow. The world he had known, the simple history of his family's prosperity, had been fractured. His father, Jedediah Harlan, was an old man now, his hair white, his hands knotted with arthritis. He spent his days on the wide porch of the main house, looking out over the land he had built into an empire. James found him there, a blanket over his knees despite the mild afternoon. He dismounted and stood before his father, the dust of the Callum land still on his boots. "I met a man today," James began, his voice tight. "Thomas Callum." His father's placid expression did not change, but a stillness came over him, a deep, guarded quiet. "And his daughter, Nora?" James continued, watching his father's face. "They live on that small homestead on the East Ridge. He told me a story about you, about his father, about a partnership deed that was never filed." Jedediah Harlan stared out at his green fields, at the cattle grazing peacefully by the river. The silence stretched, thick with the weight of unspoken history. "He was a good man, William Callum," Jedediah said at last, his voice thin and reedy. "A better man than me." And then the story came out. Not in a rush, but in slow, painful pieces. It was a story of a hard winter, of cattle dying, of desperation and fear. They had been partners, he and William Callum. They had shaken hands on the division of the valley. But the winter had been brutal, and Jedediah, fearing ruin, had used the last of their shared capital to bribe the land agent and file the claim in his name alone. He had told himself he would make it right later, when things were better. "And the claim jumper?" James asked, his voice raw. Jedediah flinched. "There was talk. I heard some men were looking to jump the upper claim where Will was working. I should have ridden up there. I should have warned him." He looked at his knotted hands. "But I was a coward. I was afraid if he was gone, the whole thing would be simpler. I didn't want him dead, son. I swear to you. But I was weak, and my weakness got him killed." He finally looked at James, his eyes clouded with a shame that was 20 years old. "I told myself it was for you, to build something for you, but it was for me, for my pride." He got up stiffly and went inside, returning with a small, leather-bound ledger. "I never made it right. I never had the courage." He handed the book to James. "It's all in there. The original agreement. What he put in, what I put in. What his half would be worth now." James took the ledger. It was cold and heavy in his hands, the weight of a generation of lies. He had the truth, and now he had to decide what to do with it. The next morning, he rode out. He did not ride toward the Callum place. He rode to Crestfall, to the county clerk's office. He spent 2 days with the clerk and a lawyer, the old ledger open on the desk between them. On the 3rd day, he rode back to the east fence line. Nora saw him coming. A lone rider, moving at a steady pace, not with the urgency of anger but with the deliberation of purpose. She walked out to meet him, her heart a wild, frantic thing in her chest. She stopped at the fence post where they had first shared coffee. She waited. He dismounted and stood on the other side of the wire. For a long moment, they just looked at each other across the boundary that had defined their families for so long. "My father was wrong," James said, his voice clear and strong in the quiet air. "He was weak, and he was afraid, and he let his fear make him a thief. He admits it." Nora closed her eyes for a second, a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. "He sent this," James continued, holding out the old ledger. "And this." He produced a folded legal document. "I've been to the clerk. The deed has been filed. Half the valley, the river bottom land, everything south of the creek, it's in the Callum name. It's yours." She stared at the papers, at the proof of restitution, the mending of a tear that had rent her family's life. It was more than she had ever dreamed of. But her eyes lifted from the papers to his face. "That's the land," she said, her voice quiet. "What about you?" A look of vulnerability crossed his face, a raw honesty that stripped away everything but the man standing before her. "The name doesn't matter to me, Nora. The land doesn't matter. Not without you." He took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about what you said, about the sky being bigger up here. I think you're right. I love you, and I would like to stay, Nora, on this side of the fence. As your husband, if you'll have me." It was a plain-spoken declaration, offered with nothing but the humble sincerity of his heart. There was no poetry, no flourish, only the simple, solid truth. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his image. She reached across the fence, not for the papers, but for his hand. "You got here," she whispered, a small, watery smile touching her lips. "It took you long enough." His hand closed around hers, strong and warm. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I did." Their courtship was a quiet, practical affair, much like the two of them. It was conducted over shared meals, this time with her father sitting at the head of the table, his silence slowly changing from stony disapproval to a grudging, watchful acceptance. It was found in the long days James and Thomas Callum spent writing the new boundary lines, not as rivals, but as men building a future. The conversations were about cattle and water rights, and the best place to build a new, larger house that could join the two properties. The past was not forgotten, but it was set aside, a healed wound that would always be a scar, but no longer an open sore. They were married in the small church in Crestfall as the first snows of winter began to dust the high peaks. Nora wore a simple cream-colored dress her mother had made long ago, and in her hands she carried not flowers, but a sprig of pine from the ridge where she and James had looked out over the valley. James stood beside her, his gaze steady and sure. Jedediah Harlan sat in the front pew, a frail old man watching the undoing of his greatest sin, a quiet absolution in the union of his son with a Callum. The town watched, a silent chorus that had seen the feud simmer for a generation, and now saw it end not with a fight, but with a promise. 7 years later, Nora sat on the porch of the new house, a cup of coffee in her hands. It was a solid, handsome structure, built of pine from their own land, with a wide porch that looked west, toward the river. James sat on the top step, mending a bridle, his hands moving with the same familiar, steady competence she had first noticed in the grazing cabin. A boy of 6, with his father's clear blue eyes and a stubborn lock of dark hair, was meticulously trying to build a fence out of twigs, while a little girl of 4, her hair the same shade of brown as Nora's, sat beside him, watching his progress with a quiet, serious intensity. "He sets a post just like you," Nora said, a smile in her voice. "Like he's trying to reason with it." James looked up, his own smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "And she watches just like you, figuring out how to do it better before he's even finished." He set the bridle aside and looked out over the land, now whole and prosperous under their combined care. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep violet. The sky is bigger from this porch, too. Nora came and sat on the step beside him, leaning her head against his shoulder. The children's quiet chatter was a soft murmur in the background. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of hay and the promise of rain. It was a simple moment, one of thousands they had shared, built on a foundation not of a name or of land, but of a quiet, unshakable knowledge of the person beside them. It was a life built not on what was taken or what was given back, but on the brave and simple choice to help a stranger in the grass and to trust the man over the brand he wore. That's the thing about a gesture of care. It can be a quiet act, as simple as bringing a man in from the cold, but sometimes it is powerful enough to redraw every map and mend the oldest of fences.